I would like to now proceed with the introduction, ma'am. Dr. Manuel Saldivar is a cognitive scientist and educational psychologist. He applies quantitative methods to the study of learning and cognition. His research focuses on identifying factors that influence college students' success, as well as educators' use of technology for teaching. His day job is lecturing for the Learning Framework program at the University of Grande. So thank you, welcome, Dr. Saldivar. We look forward to your session.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and that so many colleagues are able to join us. I'm trying to balance not being rude and maneuvering the laptop here, so I'm going to just sit here on the edge of the frame if that's okay. Let me go ahead and begin first. Get my slides up.
Oh, do you have the slides there? Did you share them with Nayeli?
Actually, I posted these slides as well as some other resources to my website, and I'll let y'all know the link at the end of the presentation.
Okay.
Great. So, thank you. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. So again, I'm Manuel Saldivar. I'm a cognitive scientist and educational psychologist, which is kind of a mouthful, but I think is descriptive. That's why I use it. I actually grew up here in Brownsville and went to undergrad at UT Austin. Did my doctoral work at the University of Colorado and was a postdoc at Florida State. And I've been here at UTRGV since 2014. I came back because my parents are retired, still here in Brownsville. So I'm happy to be here at this institution and also working with our population. So my topic is on teaching critical thinking. I'm going to focus on starting out on the perspective that cognitive science and cognitive psychology have on critical thinking. But first, I want to acknowledge the fact that all of us coming from different disciplines think about critical thinking in different ways, which is fine. In fact, it's actually, as I will explain here in a bit, key to understanding critical thinking is the idea or the concept of focusing on how your discipline thinks about critical thinking. So to get us cognitively warmed up, I'd like everyone to find a partner or a small group and take just a couple minutes, see if you can come up with some definitions, a list rather, of at least 3 examples from your own experience in your own field of critical thinking. And I'll get back together in a couple minutes. Okay, everyone, if we can go ahead and get back together. All right, so if you're wondering if I was going to reveal, correct, incorrect answer in terms of those examples that y'all came up with, the answer, it's okay. The answer really is that all of them are correct. And that's not just kind of a cutesy dodge for the talk. I actually will explain what I mean by that in a second. But keep that list of examples in your mind. They'll come back into play in a second. Let me run over the 3 learning objectives that I have for this presentation. The first one is to start by defining critical thinking from the perspective of cognitive science, which doesn't mean that it's the only example or the correct definition, but just so you know where I'm coming from. And you'll see how actually one of the things I will present is that these ideas, as I'm going to kind of frame them, are meant to be interleavened with your own fields. So we'll get to that. Second, recognize the challenges to teaching critical thinking. Obviously, that's something that all of us that are educators have experienced, and how those challenges affect this whole issue, but also how can we try and overcome them. And then finally, I do want to talk explicitly, because I've been to talks where people have great ideas, blah, 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 but how do you do it? Well, that's part 2. I'm not going to stick you with a part 2. I'm going to finish with some suggestions about incorporating critical thinking in your teaching. So let me start with a story. On the left, this gentleman is Dr. Daniel Willingham. He is a cognitive psychologist. He teaches at the University of Virginia. He's one of my personal academic heroes because I'm a big nerd. On the right is a cafe Americano. Willingham has written a lot on critical thinking, and he actually had, as often happens, I guess, in science or in research, he had a personal experience that gave him new insights into this particular issue. So I'm going to repeat his story because it's better than anything I came up with. So one time, Willingham was traveling, flying somewhere with his daughter, who was about high school age. And while waiting in an airport, Willingham wanted to get coffee. Now, I like coffee, but I'm not a big connoisseur. But apparently, a cafe Americano is espresso with hot water added. How that differs from what I call coffee, I'm not sure, but there it is. So Willingham asked his daughter, "Hey, I'm going to get some coffee," and she said, "No, Dad, I'll go get it. I'll go down to the Starbucks here in the airport. I'll get your cafe americano. I know what you like, and I'll get a coffee for myself, and come back." He said, "Great." So he gave her a few bucks. She went down. Some time passes. She comes back, gives him his drink and change, and he notices that there's more change back than he expects. And he said, "Are they having a sale or something? Why was this cheaper?" Well, his daughter realized that a cafe americano is a shot of espresso and a bunch of hot water added to the glass, and Starbucks charges whatever thousands of dollars for that. But she was able to get the insight that, wait, why don't I just buy an espresso shot and get hot water for free from the hot water dispenser they have for folks that buy tea or whatever, and she paid just a couple dollars. So Willingham was quite taken aback by this, and it set him on a whole different path of his research. To quote from Willingham directly, "What makes this example interesting is that someone could think to try working the angles of a coffee shop menu, but most people would not. Critical thinking is not the difficulty of thinking successfully, it's deciding to think in the first place. Educators should hope to instill this quality in students." So I don't want to dwell on this too much other than to make the point. I think for me, I don't expect everyone to agree, but from my perspective, just where I'm coming from, I think this really boils it down. I often push my students, whatever the course is or whatever their own discipline is, their own major, don't be afraid of asking, "So what?" My Dr. Chu is talking about cellular biology stuff. So what? How does it matter? Not in a disrespectful way, but in the sense of, how does this fit into my growth, my development? How does it fit into my academic and career plan? So what? If I take a history class, how does that fit into who I am? I'm not a history major. Why am I taking a history class? So what? I think it's a good way for students to make connections. And so for me, this example goes to this idea of critical thinking. There's detailed characteristics, which I'll lay out here in a sec, but ultimately it's deciding to think in the first place. So hopefully that was an awesome example to get us started. Now, going back to Willingham, he talks about critical thinking in kind of a general ways. That's why I said earlier that there's not one right definition, but I want to kind of lay down some foundational markers that I think will kind of guide us as we think about this idea. So he sees critical thinking as original in the moment, not carried over from a previous situation, right? So to go back to the coffee example, although certainly, I guess, Willingham's daughter knew his coffee taste well enough to know that he likes a cafe americano. She could have just been robotic and followed a prior process, or what we call a heuristic in psychology. She could have just gone like on autopilot and said, "Well, he likes cafe americano. They cost $35,000 at Starbucks. That's what I'll pay," and give it back to him. But she found a better way. She thought in the moment. Critical thinking is self-directed. It's not necessarily or seldom following instructions from another person. Again, in terms of the so what that we're going to push for our students to think about, right? Independent thought is part of critical thinking. Understanding a novel situation that we may never have explicitly covered in our classroom, nonetheless, they may encounter in their doing of whatever their own field or their career is. And yet this information, these concepts that they learn, the ways of thinking can be beneficial. It can help them direct themselves to how to solve that problem or overcome that challenge. And then finally, critical thinking respects conventions that make it more likely to yield useful conclusions. So by conventions here, we mean for our own individual fields, how do we do stuff? When I do psychology or cognitive science, there's certain methodologies that I use, there's certain foundational concepts that come into play. When someone studies biology or history or chemistry or engineering, there are foundational concepts. Again, not just ideas, but ways of doing, we might call research methods, that are used in that field because that's how that field has been able to develop and solve questions. Any questions so far? All right. So to go to the challenges, because this is kind of the meat of the issue, and I want to take a step back and just make an editorial comment. So a lot of cognitive scientists, including Willingham, are they comfortable talking about describing stuff as critical thinking or not critical thinking? I don't like to do that. My own philosophy is that some kinds of thinking, or if you will, problem solving, are more appropriate for a given situation than others. But I don't know if I'd ever want to label some kind of thinking or thought process as bad or not good. So I'm going to use the terms more critical versus less critical. So more critical thinking, the characteristics are what we have already discussed. But when we think about less critical thinking strategies. And these are where the challenges to teaching critical thinking come from. Or not just teaching, but actually being a critical thinker. Original thinking can still be illogical or ignore evidence, right? So we want our students to be comfortable thinking on their own, but I'm sure most, if not all of us, have had cases where students were led astray by their original thinking, not because they're bad people or bad students, but because perhaps they don't have the expertise to really understand or get a grip on nuances or pitfalls or however we want to think of it that we might know because we have more expertise in an area. Sometimes ignoring instructions is not beneficial. So sometimes you don't want students to be self-directed. An example that I use here is, I don't have a medical background, but I know EMTs, for example, people that help military medics, they have protocols that they're supposed to follow when they're treating someone who has a traumatic injury. And I don't know all the sequence to it, but I know there is a sequence, and that sequence is taught to them not because shut up and do what you're told, but because those fields, medical science in this case, I guess, has determined that most of the time for most people, if you follow the sequence, you'll have better outcomes. And then finally, without knowledge of paradigms such as the scientific method or what I'm going to call best practices, whatever that looks like for our field, individual reason can result in mistakes, right? To use a particularly nerdy example, but I think it makes my point. So I like to read about ancient Greek philosophers because I'm nerdy, and you will you can find these very elegant. These arguments that'll bring tears to your eye that these ancient Greeks came up with that are wrong. You know, the ancient Greeks thought that disease, to stay in that vein of medical stuff, disease was caused by an imbalance of humors in our body. So they didn't, take into account microorganisms and whatever. So again, the point is, a logical argument that is predicated on an incorrect assumption is going to be wrong, no matter how beautiful the logic is. So my point to these three less critical aspects, or these bullet points that are challenges to critical thinking, is again, all this kind of ends up being a double-edged sword. That's why I think of less versus more critical, not is or is not critical. So overcoming these less critical kind of impulses that students may have, I think, is the answer to, or the beginning at least of the answer to how can we get better at teaching critical thinking. Any questions or comments before I move on?
Yes, I have one more of a comment.
Okay.
At the beginning, I'm sorry, I'm Jorge Vidal with Civil Engineering. So I was telling my colleagues that I kind of relate critical thinking to thinking outside the box. When I first saw that bullet that says respect conventions, I was kind of wondering what you meant, but I think with the less critical note there, you're just talking about a general structure, not about the individual critical thinking of a particular discipline in this case, right?
Yes, actually, that's an excellent point, and I can see how that would be a little vague. So let me give a short example, maybe to illustrate that idea about conventions. So, in speaking from social and behavioral science, which is my background, that field uses a scientific method. We don't obviously have perfect answers, perfect solutions every time, but we use a scientific method to try and find answers to, in my case, cognitive issues or questions about how our minds work. But my point to all that is a scientific method, in my training and from my experience, in my field, should trump the source of information. If I ever had a freshman student who somehow, and I sincerely hope this happens, that would be awesome. If I had a freshman who had some awesome, fantastic research design to answer some cutting edge question in cognitive science, and their method was sound, and we knew the limitations and the sample and all the stuff we think about when we evaluate research, that would be fantastic. If I was a historian, and I have a bachelor's in history, so I won't call myself a historian, but I know a little tiny bit about that field in terms of the doing history, so to speak. In history, the source of information is very important, right? In 200 years, if some poor archaeologist finds my crappy journals, my comments on politics or whatever, they could care less. I'm just some guy screaming in the wilderness, right? But if I was, assistant to the secretary of whatever, I may, as a source, myself, capital S, I may, for a historian, be an important source because of who I was, who I worked with, whatever. So that's kind of what I mean by conventions. Different fields will have different conventions, different standards, different methods, if you will. And certainly I would not, the point is not, to be clear, one is better than other. It's just that there are differences that have developed because of how different fields have developed. Does that kind of address your point?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So let's get back to our friend Willingham. So he kind of approaches this issue of teaching critical thinking. The problem with fostering critical thinking, it shouldn't be plural. Fostering critical thinking is that people who learn broadly applicable principles in one situation often fail to apply them in a new situation. There can be a surprising failure to deploy useful knowledge. And what he's arguing here is that, and this is going to go to our more concrete next steps here in a moment, what he argues is that a lot of times, so it's kind of a good news, bad news thing for all of us. So the good news is that cognitive science has found there is some benefit to the idea or the concept of teaching critical thinking, quote unquote, at kind of an abstract level. But most of that benefit is going to be in the context of how someone is taught that approach to critical thinking. To give you an example of sort of, I guess, problem solving, if you've ever seen, and I happen to, maybe because I'm aware of it, but I've been hearing a lot of ads on the radio in particular, I'm not sure why, but ads on the radio, internet, TV for these brain puzzle websites. You subscribe to the website. They claim to be based on brain science, quote unquote. And their whole pitch is if you subscribe to our website for $99 a month and you solve these puzzles or whatever, we'll improve your memory, we'll improve your response time. Well, the evidence suggests that if you play a lot of chess, you'll get better at chess. How much of that of your chess skill would transfer to other domains, other cognitive domains, other skill sets? The answer is it depends, and often the answer is it's not a lot. So that's the point here that Willingham is making. When we think about critical thinking, we have to contextualize it for our students, because presenting it as a general concept, even if they walk away with learning some techniques or some kinds of critical thinking, so to speak, it often will end up operating at a very general level. Now, why does this happen? That's a big question that I'm not going to get into. I will speculate. A guy that I know a little bit and I think has some credibility argues that it's most likely because of cognitive bias. That seemed funnier before I put the slide up. The cognitive bias thing, just briefly to define that, is, we have a default switches in our brains, and often we approach thinking in this default manner that's not really neutral. So, for example, we may know logically, if we sit and talk to ourselves or convince ourselves that a sample size of 1 is not a lot of data, right? And yet, how often are we impacted in our impression of another person that we've met, based on that first impression? Because of our Pleistocene era brains, that first impression has a huge impact on us. Even though we should know, well, if I met this person, he seemed like a big jerk, I've met him once. What do I really know about him? What was happening in his life? What was going on at that day? Why should I ascribe so much worth to one meeting, one encounter? I should be a scientist, gather more data, have a bigger N, and interact with the person more and figure out what's going on. But a lot of times, and I've done this myself, I certainly am not immune, we meet one person, they seem like a jerk. Well, they're a jerk. I don't want to deal with that guy anymore. Again, a cognitive bias that makes it hard for us to apply critical thinking. But again, the point to that is that that's a possible answer to why is this happening, but that's kind of a different discussion. What I want to move towards is what we all hopefully came for, which is the idea of how to teach critical thinking. So again, these techniques that I'm going to lay out are based on the cognitive science. Willingham has taken the lead on doing this research. He's done a lot of awesome lit reviews, and his lab has done a lot of research into this, but certainly other studies have triangulated his findings. So let me go through these 4, and then we'll have a chance to discuss. So first, to teach critical thinking, we need to model how critical thinking looks in our own domain. So again, to go back to a prior example, when I teach students how to think about doing psychology or doing cognitive science, quote unquote, I'm going to talk about, among other things, the scientific method, because that's how psychologists, cognitive scientists try to learn stuff. If I was a historian, I would talk about what are the sources of your information, because that's something historians care about. And I won't dip my toes into fields that are not mine, because I'll get in trouble. But I assume biologists, anthropologists, engineers, chemists, everyone has their own visions or models of how critical thinking looks in your own domain. So being explicit about that is important. You want to identify critical content knowledge and its applications. And again, I admit this is something that I personally struggle with because it's tough. And what we mean here is the idea of when we teach something, when we talk about an idea, we want to make sure our students understand, so what? Why does this matter? When you learn cellular biology, why does it matter to understand the parts of the cell? Are we just trying to torture you by memorizing a bunch of stuff? Or does that foundational knowledge have a role to play? When I teach a cognitive psychology class, when I talk about certain ideas, are these ideas just meant for you to regurgitate on a quiz? Or is it meant for you to be able to learn some higher principles? Third, we want to teach concepts in a sequence that supports new learning. And again, I recognize this may seem like a statement of the obvious, but at least for me, and I'll talk for myself, I found this to be a tremendous challenge and something that, more than anything else in my teaching, I tweak from semester to semester. If I'm teaching ideas A, B, and C, I usually will sequence them as A, B, C because I feel from my expertise, well, this makes sense. How else would you learn it? Well, how else would you learn it? If I learned it, if I think about it as A, B, C, is that the only possible way to think about that idea? What if someone else may have a case to make or may be able to teach B and they and then A and then C? In other words, and again, I do this myself. We think of lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3 as encapsulated sort of units, and they are. I mean, we have stuff we do for every unit, right? Readings, quizzes, activities, whatever. But are we presenting our units in the best way for a novice learner, not necessarily for an expert? And then finally, we need to, and this is my maybe clumsy phrasing, but I think it gets to the point. We need to decide what foundational skills are needed to teach our content. I'm going to be real blunt. It's just us chickens here. I admit in dark moments when I've had a particular tough lesson that I know, without false modesty, is not because I'm not a competent educator, but because I walked in assuming students knew stuff they should have learned in part 1 of a sequence of courses, or they should have picked up in high school, or whatever. And I kind of rage about, how do these kids get through all the stuff, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not productive. It doesn't solve anything. And so my decision, doesn't mean everyone has to do this or should do this, but my take on this is, I did decide, okay, when I teach psychology students, a lot of times, even though students should have been exposed to at least the basic model of the scientific method, a lot of times they have not been. And instead of, whose fault was that, or the high schools, blah, 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 all the stuff, what does it really do? I can complain about it, or I can try and decide, all right, if I'm going to have a concept that is really particularly key for them to have a grip on the scientific method because it helps explain the findings or whatever, then I'm going to work in a discussion of that and just know that if that's what it takes for that particular concept or idea to make the best sense to help them learn to think critically instead of just memorizing stuff, then that's kind of a skill. That's a choice that I want to make. All right, that was a lot of stuff. I want to pause for any questions or comments before I move on to the final piece here. All right. Well, let me turn things over to the group then. So what I'd like you to do in your groups or pairs, however you want to divide yourselves up, is choose one of these 4 criteria that Willingham offers and consider how that might lead you to modify or change the lesson you're teaching, and then share your thoughts with your group so we can kind of learn from each other. As time allows, move on to other criteria and let other folks in the group offer their thoughts. And we'll see what we can learn from one another, and then we'll get back together maybe in 10 minutes. Sound okay?
Yep.
All right, let's give it a shot. Okay, we're all back together? Okay, hopefully y'all had a good discussion. I think we had a good one here. Let me just kind of wrap up with another thought from our friend Willingham. So Willingham argues, just to summarize all this, it's not useful to think of critical thinking skills once acquired as broadly applicable. Wanting students to be able to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information sounds like a reasonable goal, but analysis, synthesis, and evaluation mean different things in different disciplines. And I think ultimately that's a challenge that we all face. But hopefully some of these ideas that he's offered and that the cognitive science has offered, again, not to overwrite or are better than how other fields think about this, but just kind of offer us maybe the beginning of a common vocabulary as we sort of tackle this issue. Final thing, if you would like to learn more about any of these things, on my website, as soon as you go to that URL, on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a section that's called Quick Links. There I have a link to a cloud folder that's publicly available that I set up. It includes this slide deck, if anybody has any interest, as well as a paper by Willingham that's fairly short, about 7 or 8 pages, that he put out about, I think, 6 years ago. That's still a very good introduction to his thinking, as well as kind of a short little review of critical thinking stuff. And I linked also a couple of other websites off of that page, or off of that folder rather, that talk about, that actually provide concrete artifacts that you might use in your own teaching for different critical thinking exercises. Some of them make more sense for some department or some fields versus others. That's why I didn't want to get into them in this discussion. But that is available for you if you'd like it. Otherwise, I'm happy to field any questions, but otherwise we are done.